You walk into a standard supermarket, right?
Mhm.
And you've got like 50 different cereal boxes just fighting for your attention.
Oh, yeah. Bright colors, mascots, bold claims. It's sensory overload.
Exactly. And it feels empowering,
Mhm.
Like you hold all the power as the consumer, deciding exactly which box gets your hard-earned money. It's an illusion of choice.
Right.
But then you walk into a massive warehouse club, and that dynamic is just entirely dead. The choices are gone. You get what's on the pallet.
You get the pallet or you get nothing.
Yeah. So today, we're doing a deep dive into episode 9 from the ReThink History series, from the Trading Post to Amazon, and this one is titled The Kirkland Effect. Our mission today is exploring how one specific retail model basically took away your choices, weaponized speed and price, and why you actually, thank them for it by paying a fee just to walk through the door.
Which is such a wild concept when you really step back and look at it. We're really trying to answer the ultimate question of modern retail here, which is who actually decides what ends up on the shelf in front of you? And maybe more importantly, what happens to the brand that was sitting on that shelf yesterday?
So that brings us to a really perfect starting point. The compiler of this history series, Nick McKenzie, he's a Costco member himself, and he shared this personal observation that kind of sets up the whole tension of this deep dive.
I love this anecdote.
It's so good. He paints this picture of his local warehouse, specifically the dry dog food aisle, because he watches a national brand arrive on a pallet, and, it does great, sells well for a season or two.
Sure.
Then, one day, a Kirkland Signature version appears right beside it, and then just a little while later, the national brand completely vanishes.
Okay, so we need to put a giant flashing warning light on that story right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
That is one shopper's personal observation. It is absolutely not a documented corporate case study. I mean, Costco does not publish any sort of delisting sequences, and the stock varies wildly from region to region.
Yeah, that's a very important flag.
But as a framing device, it's brilliant. So we are going to check his memory against the actual factual record of what Costco sells online in mid-August 2026, later on in the deep dive. But to understand how a store could even theoretically pull off a maneuver like that, we have to look at the inheritance of this entire model.
The blueprint. And the funny thing is, this wasn't cooked up in some modern Silicon Valley incubator. This starts with a lawyer, a guy named Saul Price.
Yes, the legendary Saul Price.
Born in the Bronx, ends up practicing law out in San Diego. And he didn't even set out to be a retail titan. But in 1953, a client takes him up to Los Angeles to check out this place called Fedco.
Right, and Fedco was a nonprofit membership department store. But the catch was, it was restricted exclusively to postal workers.
Which is such a specific demographic.
It really is. So Saul Price walks in, looks at the operation, and he just realizes the underlying mechanics are incredible. So on December 3rd, 1954, he literally copies the concept and opens FedMart in a warehouse down near the San Diego tuna canneries. He charges a $2 lifetime membership fee, and just like Fedco, you couldn't just walk in off the street. You had to be a federal employee or a military veteran.
Wait, I got to pause you on that.
Right.
Why on earth would you intentionally restrict your customer base in 1954?
It sounds crazy, right?
You're a brand new business. Don't you want every single dollar walking past your door?
It completely flies in the face of normal retail logic, but it's based on the logic of the military post exchange. By restricting the clientele to government workers and veterans, people with steady paychecks and a certain level of built-in community accountability, he drastically lowered the risk of shoplifting and bad checks.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the bad checks part.
Yeah, when your shrinkage goes way down and you know exactly who your customer is, you can operate on incredibly lean margins. Plus, it creates a psychological feeling of being in an exclusive club.
I love looking at the psychology here because Saul Price accidentally invented something massive. If you think about it, it's basically a subscription model decades before software companies were using that word.
Oh, absolutely.
When you pay a fee before you are even allowed to look at the merchandise, it just completely flips the psychology of shopping. Every single purchase you make after paying that entry fee feels like you're recovering a sunk cost.
Yes. You aren't just buying a toaster, you're actively justifying your membership.
Exactly.
And that sunk cost psychology, it turns a casual shopper into a highly defensive subscriber. And the model was just a massive hit. But corporate history is always messy, right?
Always.
By 1975, FedMart had been sold to a German retail group, and Saul Price actually gets fired from the very company he founded.
Getting fired from your own company is just a brutal pivot.
It really is.
But he doesn't just retire and hit the golf course. On July 12, 1976, he answers back. He opens Price Club in this massive, bare concrete, former aircraft hangar on Marina Boulevard in San Diego.
Zero frills.
Literally zero. Just goods on pallets.
And the legacy of that specific hangar cannot be overstated. I mean, when Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, wrote his autobiography, Made in America, he flat out admitted that he borrowed more ideas from Saul Price than from anyone else in the industry.
Wow.
Yeah, Walton literally took the Price Club blueprint and launched Sam's Club in 1983.
So the guy who built the biggest retailer on Earth looked at an aircraft hangar in San Diego and said, I need to copy exactly what he's doing.
Pretty much, yeah.
But how did we get from Saul Price's hangar to the modern hyper-disciplined machine we know today?
Well, we follow the protege, a guy named Jim Sinegal.
Okay, Jim Sinegal.
Sinegal started out as an 18-year-old kid bagging groceries and unloading trucks at FedMart back in 1955, so he learned the gospel of Saul Price from the ground up.
He was there for the whole ride.
Exactly. Fast forward to 1983, Sinegal teams up with a Seattle lawyer named Jeff Brotman, and they open the very first Costco in Seattle. Then, 10 years later in 1993, Costco merges with Price Club to really consolidate their power.
And what a machine they built. I mean, we pulled the data from their fiscal 25 10K filing to really look at the mechanics, and it is entirely built on doing the exact opposite of normal retail.
It really is counterintuitive.
First, let's talk about the assortment. A standard supermarket might carry 30 or 40,000 different items. A Costco warehouse carries fewer than 4,000 active items.
So Price actually had a phrase for that. He called it the intelligent loss of sales.
That sounds like a terrible business plan, intelligently losing sales.
I know, but it's brilliant. If a customer is absolutely demanding a fourth brand of ketchup, you just let them go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because keeping your inventory that tightly restricted, it means your logistics are insanely efficient.
Right.
You are buying a few things in astronomical quantities.
But if they only carry 4,000 items, why do people spend 3 hours wandering around in there?
Yeah.
This is where the whole treasure hunt concept comes in, right?
Precisely. If you only sell pallets of toilet paper and bulk flour, it's just a boring chore, so they intentionally rotate in high-end, unexpected luxury items.
Yeah, you walk in for paper towels and suddenly you trip over a kayak.
Or a massive plush bear. Or a luxury watch. It creates the psychological urgency. If you see it today, you have to buy it today because it won't be there next week. It forces the member to walk down every single aisle just to see what's hiding.
And while you're hunting, you know you're protected by the markup ceiling. It's their stated internal philosophy to cap markups at 14% on national brands.
Which is wild.
Think about that. Most department stores are marking up clothing or electronics by 40 or 50%. And add to that, they pay famously high wages. The fiscal 2025 data shows a U.S. average hourly rate of about $32.
And we can't ignore the anchor of it all, right? The $1.50 hot dog and soda combo, untouched since 1985.
It is legendary.
That hot dog is essentially the physical manifestation of their pricing authority. But I want to stop and look at the financial data you pulled, because there is a very pervasive myth out there that we really need to clarify.
Okay, let's hear it.
You hear this repeated all the time. Costco sells everything at cost, and their managed ship fees are their only profit.
Wait, I honestly thought that was true. Like, the math doesn't add up. If they cap markups at 14% and pay their workers $32 an hour, how could the retail side possibly make any money?
It is a heavily contested flag in business lore, and it depends entirely on which line of the ledger you are reading. Let's look at the fiscal 2025 numbers. Net sales were nearly $270 billion.
Okay.
Membership fees brought in $5.3 billion. Now, their net income was about $8.1 billion. Against that net income, the fees represent about 66%. So people see that and say, aha, fees are most of the profit.
Okay, but you're separating net income from operating income. What's the actual difference for someone listening who doesn't read corporate balance sheets for fun?
Fair question. Think of operating income as the day-to-day hustle of the business. It's the money the store makes from actually running the warehouses, selling the goods, collecting the fees, and paying the employees before the taxman and the bankers take their slice for things like interest and intertaxes.
Got it. The core business.
Right. So Costco's operating income for fiscal 2025 was $10.4 billion. Against that number, the $5.3 billion in fees is only about 51%.
Ah, so saying the fees are the profit is only barely true against the day-to-day hustle. Half is the door charge, but the other half is still coming from the actual retail markup, as lean as it is.
Exactly. But even at 51%, it shows how heavily the upfront fee stabilizes their entire financial structure. It's what allows them to keep those margins so razor thin.
So they've basically conditioned you, the shopper, to accept whatever is on the pallet because you completely trust the markup cap and, well, you already paid your fee.
Right.
But if Costco realizes that the customer is loyal to the pallet and not necessarily the brand sitting on it, why let other companies take the profit? Which brings us to the lever.
The lever.
Kirkland Signature.
Born in 1995. Because before that, Costco had a bunch of random disjointed house labels. Things like Chelsea or Meridian.
Yeah, it was a bit of a mess.
So Jim Sinegal decides to consolidate all of it under one single massive banner, named after their corporate headquarters in Washington at the time.
And the internal rule for Kirkland is just brutal for any national brand trying to compete.
Oh, yeah.
To get the Kirkland label, the product must match or beat the leading national brand on quality, and it absolutely must undercut them on price by 15 to 20%. And the scale of this is staggering. The current CEO, Ron Vakris, has noted that Kirkland is roughly a third of all Costco sales. But we have to flag that the exact dollar figures floating around out there vary depending on your source.
That's right.
The Wall Street Journal cited $86 billion for fiscal 2024, but then reports from the 2026 shareholder meeting claimed $90 billion for 2025. But honestly, either way, it means the single house brand, which makes everything from AA batteries to men's dress shirts to dog kibble, generates more revenue than the entirety of Procter & Gamble.
Which leads to the open secret of the retail world. Because Costco doesn't own some secret sprawling mega factory that miraculously produces both premium olive oil and golf balls.
No. The very premium brands they're competing with are the ones manufacturing the Kirkland products.
Exactly.
Former CEO Craig Jelinek confirmed on camera that Duracell makes the Kirkland batteries. Kimberly-Clark makes the diapers. Starbucks custom roasts the espresso. It actually says so right on the bag.
And this brings us right back to the dry dog food aisle from Nick McKenzie's anecdote at the start. Who makes the Kirkland dog food? Diamond Pet Foods.
Right.
They are a family-owned company in Missouri that makes Taste of the Wild and other premium lines. And this was actually outed publicly during a 2012 salmonella recall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the recall list came out, and there were the Kirkland formulas right alongside Diamond's own premium brands.
Wait, we have to pause here. If I am a premium national brand, why on earth would I run my own factories overnight to manufacture the exact cheaper product that is going to steal my customers the next morning? That's like digging your own grave just because the graveyard pays a really good hourly wage.
That is a great analogy, but it's all about utilization of factory capacity and sheer leverage. If Costco only carries 4,000 items, a spot on their pallet is literally the most valuable real estate in retail. If Diamond Pet Food says no to making Kirkland kibble, Costco will just find someone else who will. So a smaller piece of the massive Costco pie, even disguised under the Kirkland label, is better than being completely banished from the warehouse.
And Costco is not afraid to banish you. They will flex that muscle publicly. My absolute favorite documented case of this was in November 2009. It was a standoff with Coca-Cola.
Oh, this is a classic.
Costco literally just stopped restocking Coke products. And they didn't do it quietly behind closed boardroom doors. They put printed signs up in the aisles telling you, the member, exactly why there was an empty pallet.
Which you never see.
Never. The sign said Coca-Cola had not provided Costco with competitive pricing.
It's incredibly rare to see a supplier negotiation bleed out onto the shop floor like that. But Costco knows their allegiance is to the member's perception of value, not to a supplier's famous logo. And within a month, Coca-Cola caved, prices were adjusted, and the pallets were restocked.
They even messed with the beverage giants again later. In 2013, they switched the fountain drinks in the food court to Pepsi, strictly to maintain the margins on that untouched $1.50 hot dog combo.
Right, before finally switching back to Coke recently in 2025 and 2026. The pricing rule always, always outranks the brand name.
So we know Costco has the leverage to pull this off. They can force suppliers to make Kirkland, or they can boot them out. But let's bring it back to the opening story from the compiler of the history series.
Right, Nick McKenzie in the dog food aisle.
Yes. He stands there and says he watches national brands get replaced by Kirkland and then disappear. Does the actual aisle reflect that ruthless dominance?
Well, it's time to verify the claim. We went on to Costco.com in mid-August 2026, and we ran a search for dry dog food.
And the results are fascinating. We found 12 different Kirkland Signature dry dog foods listed.
Yeah.
And how many national brands? Exactly one.
One.
Blue Buffalo. And it was even flagged as warehouse only.
So what was missing?
0 Purina, 0 Pedigree, 0 IAMs, and ironically, 0 of the Diamond branded kibble, even though Diamond is the one manufacturing the Kirkland bags sitting right there.
Now, we have to inject a heavy dose of reality here. That snapshot absolutely shows an aisle totally dominated by Kirkland. 12-1 is a massive tilt.
Massive.
But Mackenzie's specific story that a brand arrives, gets cloned, and then gets killed off is still just an anecdote. Because warehouse stock varies wildly depending on what region you live in, and because Costco guards its delisting data closely, one online snapshot isn't hard evidence of a deliberate copy-and-kill strategy.
That's fair. It's a single snapshot in time, not a historical timeline. But man, if you're that one bag of Blue Buffalo sitting next to 12 massive bags of Kirkland, you have to feel pretty precarious.
You definitely do. But this is where we have to deliver the steelman argument, right? The absolute best possible defense of Costco's model.
Let's hear it.
It's easy to look at that aisle and paint them as a ruthless monopoly squeezing suppliers, but the reality is deeply rooted in consumer protection. First off, private label brands are not some sinister modern invention. As we covered in episode 6, A&P grocery stores were doing this a full century ago with their own house coffee.
Right. Store brands have been around forever.
Exactly. Second, those markup caps. 14% on national brands and 15% on Kirkland. Even if that is a stated corporate philosophy rather than an audited, legally binding rule, it functions as a highly visible promise.
Yeah.
Kirkland is priced by a rule that you, the member, can actually verify and feel in your wallet.
Plus, they intentionally place the national brands right next to the Kirkland versions when they can. They want you to see the yardstick. They want you to look at the name brand batteries for $20 and the Kirkland batteries for $16 and realize in real time exactly how much the membership fee is saving you.
And the ultimate proof that this arrangement is fair.
Right.
You can walk away. You pay up front for the privilege of shopping there. If you don't like the limited selection or you're mad that Purina is gone, you just don't renew your membership.
But people don't walk away.
They don't. The renewal rate for the US and Canada in fiscal 2025 was an astonishing 92.3%. So when we ask our driving question, who decides what's on the shelf at Costco, the answer is a physical buyer, an upfront fee, and a rigid markup cap, all acting to defend the member's wallet.
Okay, when you lay it out like that, it makes total sense. You are opting into this tightly curated ecosystem. But it leaves me with this lingering, slightly uneasy thought.
Oh?
Costco's immense power works because it is physical. It's visible. It's an actual buyer in an office adhering to a stated philosophy with physical pallets and printed pricing signs.
Right.
But what happens when the entity watching what wins on the shelf isn't a physical warehouse? What happens when it's an invisible digital algorithm that can track your clicks, copy the best-selling products instantly, and change prices in a millisecond?
Oh man, that is the exact tension we're moving toward next. You are describing the ultimate digital evolution of this market leverage, and that is exactly what we will be tackling in episode 10, the Everything Store.
Oh, I can't wait.
We'll be looking at Amazon's massive flywheel and the serious accusations that their platform watches its own third-party sellers, identifies the winners, and uses that proprietary data to launch their own competing products.
So it's the Kirkland lever, but completely stripped of the physical pallet.
Exactly.
I cannot wait to get into that one. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.